And thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. So what I'm really going to talk about is how this last year of 2020 or thereabouts changed, I guess, especially my view of science. It's been a turbulent year, interesting times. So let's start at the beginning. The day before the start of this year, there was a pneumonia outbreak reported in Wuhan in China. And the next day, officials closed Hunan market. By the 3rd, we had genetic sequencing indicating that we had a novel virus we were dealing with, at that point named 2019 nCoV. And by the 11th, there were 3 variant sequences publicly available. That's amazingly fast to go from something there just in an initial outbreak to having multiple sequences, genetic sequences for this virus. And by the 16th, some scientists in Germany had actually developed the PCR test for this virus. So that's amazingly quickly. By the 31st of January, we actually had the full sequence of this virus. That's amazingly fast. And that rapid ability to get this genetic information, which has been important throughout the whole issue of COVID, was because of changes in genetic sequencing technology. So we used to think of sequencing as requiring huge machines and taking lots of time, but in fact, you're looking there, that thing in the palm of that person's hand is a nanopore sequencer by Oxford Nanopore, and that was what was used to do this sequencing. So it's incredibly small, incredibly fast, and that is the current state of technology, which is improving all the time. And if you think that is small, yes, they are making one that will go on your mobile phone. The next thing that was amazingly rapid in all of this was the vaccine development. Usually it takes about 10 years to actually develop a vaccine, to get through all of the trials, animal trials, human trials, actually get your government approval, and then actually produce that vaccine and get that out to the public. So that's about 10 years usually. The previous fastest development of a vaccine was 4 years, and that was for mumps. COVID vaccine we had in less than 1 year, okay? And that is just fantastically fast, you know, amazingly fast. And that was because there was a huge amount of international collaboration. People put aside all of their usual petty, my lab's going to do this before your lab, and huge amounts of international collaboration and data sharing, a huge number of parallel projects of different types of vaccines being developed, parallel, or what people call efficient development stages. So instead of waiting to have everything done for approvals and then look at how you're going to start doing the actual development of production and distribution, that was all happening already. So all the stages were going on at the same time. And a huge number of new technologies, both genetic technologies, sequencing technologies, and production technologies were in use to make this thing happen so fast. That's an amazing achievement for science. And it means that really, when pushed, we could use science and technology to solve some really big problems very, very quickly. That's a good thing to keep in mind with all of the challenges that are facing our planet right now and all of human society. Now, everything, of course, wasn't perfect as we went along. And because the theme here is polyvocality for the conference, I have a few bits and pieces I've put in about that. The first one is that some people will want to silence some of the voices out there. This is Dr. Lee, and Dr. Lee posted a warning on social media that he thought that there was a SARS-like coronavirus that was coming out in China on December 30th, 2019. And in early January, he was formally reprimanded by the Chinese government for spreading misinformation. And he had to sign an agreement saying he was wrong and would not do such things again. And sadly, by the 7th of February, he was actually dead from that very same virus, a virus that had not yet received the name COVID-19. The reason it hadn't received a name, because while some people are trying to silence things, other people are trying to prevent misrepresentation. So the reason it took such a long time to have a name for a pandemic disease is because the World Health Organization has a whole set of guidelines about how you name these. And that's not just because they're a bunch of pedantic scientists. That's because they're trying to make sure that there is no stigma against any people, places, animals, countries, you name it, that are associated with a thing like a pandemic or an epidemic. And make no mistake, they have that concern for very good reason. And there's a very commonly seen thing where the President of the United States at the time kept referring to the Chinese virus. That's quite important that people were trying to prevent that. And it's quite important to recognize that someone was trying to, by association, blame the virus on a particular place. And I'm going to go over lots of bits why that just doesn't make any sense. However, before I get to that, one of the notable things for me was how important a place that science actually played in our response to this. So very quickly, we all learned that, in fact, our government has a scientific advisory group for emergencies, SAGE. We heard an awful lot about what SAGE said and what SAGE didn't say. The government insisted that they were being led by the science all the way along, and they brought scientists in and got a lot of consultation about that. So here's Boris Johnson actually surrounding himself with lead scientists as he's giving a briefing. But there were also lots of political decisions being made. And so while scientists were being consulted, they were also having their opinions being incorporated into broader decision with lots of other information, and sometimes feeling like they weren't being represented correctly and the correct decisions weren't being made. And scientists kind of learned to dread hearing news that said things were based on the best science available, because the best science available is largely a matter of opinion, especially amongst a group of scientists. It's also true that sometimes things were just being misrepresented, and scientists had to learn to keep a straight face when politicians quoted them about our response and what it was and what it should be to coronavirus. And even the generally stoic Anthony Fauci occasionally broke down in the face of misrepresentation of facts. One of the other things that was especially interesting is that we all learned an awful lot about epidemiology over the last year during this pandemic. Epidemiology is a rather complicated topic, and there's a lot of complicated mathematics in there. And yet, pretty much, we all learned a huge amount about it. Okay? We all pretty much now know what an R number is, and we all talk about transmission rates and discuss them like we used to discuss the weather. Okay, these things are now embedded in our culture, and they're based in some pretty complicated concepts about the origins and spread of diseases through populations. We learned very quickly that COVID originally came from bats. And again, genetics was very important in identifying this. We know that COVID-19 looks very similar in a lot of its genetic sequence to coronaviruses that are seen in bats. Bats have an awful lot of viral diseases that they carry without having many ill effects, and they are the source of lots of different emerging infectious diseases. Some people would argue that that's because there are special aspects to the immune system of bats, but other people would say that there's actually nothing special about bats. It's actually just that there's a lot of bat species and a lot of individual bats. And so both humans and other mammals are much more likely to run into a bat than they are to a tiger or an elephant. Now, we also learned that COVID-19 probably did not come directly to humans from bats, and it probably came through a pangolin. So if you didn't know what a pangolin was at the start of last year, I'll bet you've seen several pictures of one now. Pangolins were probably an intermediate host, and we think that because, again, of genetic analysis, the sequences of part of the virus genome are very similar to the viruses found in pangolins, especially the spike proteins that are so important in how the virus actually invades cells. And those similar spike proteins aren't seen in bat coronaviruses. That idea that there's an intermediate host isn't a new one. SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, was another virus that people were worried about not that long ago. And while that took much longer to get information about and was nowhere near as large or as serious of an epidemic, it was the same kind of pathway. Probably originally came from bats and had an intermediate host of either a raccoon dog or a palm civet that are seen here. Another one of the things that we all learned quickly in the news was that this virus probably originated in a wet market. And actually, that was incorrect. There was a wildlife market in the wet market where it originated, but wet markets in and of themselves don't actually sell wildlife. They may be associated with or have a wildlife market in them, but wet markets, like the one seen on the left here, is basically just a farmer's market like the one seen on the right. And because people misunderstood the local language in China for describing these markets, you suddenly saw all kinds of people, including political leaders all over the globe, calling for the closing of wet markets in China. That was a little bit silly, I guess, because they reacted the same way we would react if someone said, well, you must forever close all farmers' markets. That's just a difference in language between different areas. And I think we have to keep in mind that the same things exist in our own country. When I first moved to the UK, I lived in Macclesfield, and Macclesfield has a famous store that you can see a picture of here. And I have to tell you, it took me a long time to find out what a dry salter was. Okay. I suspect that it's not a term that's in very common use these days. So many of you may not also know what a dry salter is, but it was a common term once upon a time for a shop in the UK. Now, where the virus did likely come from was a wildlife market. And wildlife markets sell live animals and meat or other parts of wild animals, including things like bats or pangolins that you can see in these images. In the wildlife market where we think the virus originated from, I don't believe they were selling bats. There's lots of statements that they weren't selling pangolins, but then of course, no one would openly admit to selling pangolins because there's a ban on international trade in pangolins and it would be illegal to sell them. So it would be very hard to find out that type of information if they were being sold in that market. Another thing to keep in mind is that it's really easy to say then, well, China shouldn't be having these wildlife markets. But of course, wildlife markets occur all over the world. There's a picture in the top left there of one from South America. There are lots of places where they exist in Africa. And as you can see from the picture on the right, they exist right here in the UK. You know, people go out, hunt, and you can buy those things at a butcher. And that is a wildlife market. We also learned an awful lot about deforestation and how that's related to emerging diseases. And that is basically the story of people taking lovely bits of forest, like you can see there, and doing this. And because people then come in very close proximity to the forest, and they force local wildlife into closer interactions with humans, there's a whole list of different emerging viral diseases and other types of diseases, but just the viruses are shown here, that are associated with deforestation, usually in the tropics, but not always. And it's hard to distinguish between whether it would be a function of more tropical habitats or the fact that not so much forest exists in a lot of areas in places like Northern Europe anymore. Now, while all of this was happening and we were just starting to isolate all ourselves and being in lockdown, this happened. And this is an event that sort of shook the whole world. George Floyd was killed during arrest, May 25th, 2020, a terrible thing. And it sparked a resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, which led to demonstrations all over the world. It also led to huge effects in areas like science. And people started looking much more closely about why diversity matters so much in areas like science. So there was a renewed recognition of underrepresentation in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics subjects. In the bottom in the middle is a bit of a poster from Black in Birding events. At the top, you can see STEM is the new Black. There was Black in science. There was all kinds of different movements actually going on to look at the diversity, and not just racial diversity, but all kinds of diversity in STEM subjects. There was also a really interesting opportunity about people recognizing existing excellence that had probably not been looked at so much before. And one of the favorite things I discovered while preparing some of the information this talk is this lovely lady that you can see on the right. This is Dr. Gladys West. And Dr. Gladys West did some incredibly complicated mathematics and programming and produced the report that you can see there. And that report is the basis of a thing called the Global Positioning System, GPS. So next time you use your phone to figure out where you are or where you're going, I want you to say, thank you, Dr. West. We also learned and were reminded a lot about people that we already knew about, but aspects about them that we were not aware of or had simply forgotten. So this is George Washington Carver, who's a very early environmentalist. I knew about George Washington Carver. I do some work with agriculture, and you don't get very far in agriculture without hearing his name, because he was one of the very first people to say, well, if you've grown a lot of crops in an area that have depleted the nitrogen in the soil, you can use nitrogen-fixing plants to actually fix that problem. I knew that. What I didn't know was that he was born into slavery and no one wanted to let him into a university, and a lot of extra things had to happen so that we all benefited from the amazing knowledge that he produced. Here's another one. This is Alexander von Humboldt, one of the people who laid the foundations of geography and meteorology, very famous botanical explorer, and as I discovered, adored men. You can have a long historians and philosophers debate about whether there's any clear evidence for any of his inclinations. There is no clear written evidence, but many people would argue that it doesn't take long reading a lot of his letters to people to surmise that he had a particular orientation. This also brought up a lot of issues that people started discussing having to do with things like problems in fieldwork. Things about racism and harassment, very common in fieldwork for some individuals. That, in hindsight, shouldn't at all have been surprising. Just like if we use facial recognition technology that is only developed and trained using one race of individuals, it's not going to be particularly good at looking at other races of individuals in the same way. If we have developed all of our risk assessments with only one group of people in mind, it may not be the appropriate risk assessment for other groups of individuals. That was good that this was brought up, and I'm very happy that in fact the scientific community has responded to that quite well and come up with some really nice guidelines. And there's just one example here about how we should actually deal with this in the future so that everybody can participate and so that everyone is safe. A lot of this actually made me start to think seriously about why diversity matters in science so much. There are, of course, all of the ethical and moral reasons. We just should, of course. But there's also some very basic scientific reasons. And I've just put some of these up here. The first one is that we know that scientific ability is completely unrelated to any aspect of race, creed, orientation, cultural background, or anything else that you can think of. It just isn't. So if we exclude a proportion of the human population because of any of those characteristics, we are, by definition, including some people who would be brilliant scientists. That's an irrational thing to do. Why would we do that? A slightly more in-depth perspective is that we know that individual perspective and a variety of individual perspectives are really important in solving problems. We've got lots of studies that actually show that that's true. So groups with more diverse perspectives will solve problems faster and find more elegant and more efficient solutions than non-diverse groups. So why wouldn't we have groups that were as diverse as we could possibly make them? Last reason is one that relates more to my direct work that I do, which is looking how diversity, both genetic diversity within populations and species and ecosystem diversity, relates to ecosystem services. But it really strikes me that we all know that. People who work in that field know that genetic diversity within populations, species diversity, ecosystem diversity, biome diversity are all incredibly important to maintaining our planet and all of the ecosystem services that our lives depend on in the face of climate change. So why would that diversity in humans be any different than that? All right. Back to aspects of lockdown, climate change, that problem that was there before any of this epidemic started, and the way forward. There are some really interesting pieces, how we recognize the world around us and how we are speeding up our response to known problems. The first is, because we were in lockdown, everybody started valuing their interactions with nature far, far more. Going for a walk in nature, sometimes just even going for a walk around the block in the city, became a very precious thing. We don't want to be locked up in our houses. We want to be out, and being able to be out in nature was incredibly valuable to all of us. We also noticed lots of things while we were out there. We noticed that birds were singing, and there was a lot of talk in the news over the spring and summer about how everybody thought birds were singing louder. But actually, and this is some information from researchers here at Manchester Met, birds weren't singing louder. There just wasn't any background noise. They were actually singing more quietly than they often do, because there wasn't any background noise there that they had to sing over. And that is known as the Lombard effect. We all do this. If you go to somewhere where there's a noisy party or in a bar, please soon we'll all be able to go to a noisy party or a bar, then you will talk louder because there's so much noise around you. It's just an automatic reaction that we have, and birds have as well. So they weren't singing louder, they were singing quieter, but because there wasn't any noise, and possibly because we were paying more attention, we noticed them. Climate change, of course, is still happening. This was an issue that was there before any of this started. And that is still going on. And one of the most amazing things to me is that despite all of the expense that governments have gone through in trying to mitigate the effects of lockdown and the effects on the economy, they are pretty much around the world realizing and investing in the fact that we still need to deal with the effects of climate change. That has not gone away. Back in January of 2020, probably to what the government at the time hoped would be much fanfare, but was completely lost by a pandemic that took over the world, there was an environment bill put forward by the government. It contains a really fantastic 25-point plan for improving and maintaining the natural environment. Take a look at that sometime. But the important thing is the government is still moving forward with this plan. You might have seen this one. This is the government's 10-point plan released mid-November for a green industrial revolution. So building back better and supporting green jobs, how to recover the economy, but still be on the path to being net zero in terms of carbon emissions. And that's really quite impressive, that the government is still committed to that. There's a whole series of different things that are trying to be addressed in this 10-point plan. It's a very ambitious plan. So look, we're going to power every home in the country with offshore wind. We're going to generate huge amounts of energy through hydrogen by 2030. We're looking forward to that because here at Manchester Met, we've got a hydrogen fuel center. That should be something we can massively contribute to. We want to accelerate transition to electric cars. So let's just take a look at a few of these highlights just quickly. Wind power. So we're going to have all kinds of homes powered by wind. There's some amazing things out there. You're used to probably seeing wind turbines like the ones on the left. I only the other day saw these ones on the right. Those are bladeless wind turbines. Gets around some of the problems that you might worry about with birds and problems with spinning blades, especially in migration paths for birds. So some amazing scientific advances coming out in that area. The government has acted, and this is, I think, some of the first legislation associated with the 10-point plan by bringing forward the petrol and diesel car and van ban from 2040 to 2030. So in the UK from 2030, there will be no new petrol or diesel only cars or vans sold. Hybrids will still be allowed under some conditions, but by 2035, all new cars and vans are going to be required to be zero emissions at the tailpipe. Okay, that probably means no more hybrids except in very rare cases. In Manchester, we're very lucky that our local government has really pushed hard to move things forward. And we have a net zero carbon for new buildings that's coming into place. And that's been under development for quite a while now, and we'll see that soon. If you've tried to get around anywhere in Manchester, you've probably seen the development of all the cycle lanes and pedestrianised areas. And while the roadworks have been slightly irritating if you tried to drive anywhere, that's an amazing achievement that's taken advantage of the fact that there was less activity on the roads. And then, of course, we have our own university. We have a target to be net zero. It's probably not soon enough, and there's huge amounts of works going on to try and move that date forward. But we are already doing all kinds of things to improve things around here. You probably know about our new Brooks building, but this is a view with all the solar panels that you may not have seen before unless you looked particularly on that bit of the website. So to me, 2020 was a year of some really difficult things in all our lives, but huge advances by science, huge contributions to the whole world in terms of the virus, and especially in terms of developing new technologies, but also a time where we started to understand a lot more about the diversity that's out there in people and how that can help to contribute, and how it has already contributed, perhaps without recognition, to improving our whole world. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Richard. That was absolutely amazing. I just have to say how fascinating that was, especially from someone who is completely outside your kind of discipline as well. It was really quite eye-opening. So my name is Anton, anyway. I'm one of the committee members here. So if you guys have any questions, I'm just putting them in the chat box. But what kind of sort of, I suppose, leapt out of me in your talk, Richard, was kind of quite inspiring how, you know, the scientific community, the community kind of came together. And I suppose it kind of shows, you know, what we can do, you know, under the right kinds of pressures. And sadly also how kind of politics can sometimes get in the way as well. So yeah, so that was really interesting. Maybe we could start with just like an obvious one, Richard, as to what kind of inspired you to get into this field. Because I think maybe you perhaps don't realize how much of an inspiration you are to some of the earlier sort of researchers. I know one of them in particular on my committee. Maybe you could start with that. So, you know, what's your passion? What pulls you to this? That's all right.
So my story that started very long ago, my mother would tell you I wanted to be a biologist since I was about 3 feet tall. I think to me, the most earliest recognition that I really wanted to study biology was having gone to the coast with my parents, as we often did for the summer, and we were going to a place called Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, just as a family, because there were aquariums there. And my mother said, oh, would we be allowed to see the bits in the back? And I think this would probably never happen these days, but the people there actually allowed us to see in the back, where there was a huge number of scientists running around. Instead of the lovely bit out front where everything was a clean, shiny glass tank, in the back was old bathtubs and barrels and anything that could possibly hold some water and be used for some sort of a tank. And I just thought, well, that's how it really happens. That's the nuts and bolts, dirty bit of actually doing a hard job and finding real answers to things. I think my most lasting impression was while we were standing there, some guy zipped up to the dock, just about hit it, jumped out of his boat with a bag full of scallops and ran up the stairs. And my mother was aghast, and the man from the aquarium said, oh, ignore him. He's a scientist and he has to isolate the chemicals from the eyes of the scallops because they're trying to get a compound that will be effective against cancer. You know, that was it. I mean, people massively working hard and passionate about what it was that they were doing.
No, thank you for that. That's amazing. Yeah, I can see that you had that drive to understand those like underlying sort of mechanisms there from quite a young age. Okay, yeah, so a few questions then on this, I suppose the specifics. Obviously, you talked quite a lot about the kind of the epidemic in general, and you kind of briefly touched on it. Do you think there was a lot of sort of cultural misunderstandings and they kind of caused problems during that kind of process and obviously the ability of the scientific community to kind of deal with that? I mean, you kind of touched on it a little bit with the wet markets and how there's obviously cultural problems there. So maybe you can maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I mean, clearly, the pandemic concerns the whole world, and that world includes many different governments, many different cultures, many different perspectives. And that was going to be a challenge right from the very beginning. And I think what was so impressive to me was how quickly people tried to put aside all of those differences and find a common language to actually come up with a solution to an incredibly important problem. And I find it quite fascinating that I think sometimes the scientists from all over the world much more quickly found a common language with other scientists on the other side of the planet than they did with their own politicians in the country where they were living. And that's because, to be fair, those politicians are trying to balance other pieces of information and make appropriate decisions across the board. We didn't always agree with those decisions from a science perspective, but at least science was strongly being consulted in the process.
Okay, thank you. So we've got one in the chat from Sal. So I'm just saying to sort of come back to your point about how much we've learned about, epidemiology in the sort of last year, and the sort of, I suppose, how that kind of like terminology has now become part of the common chat. That sort of common lexicon, like you mentioned, like the acronym and things like that. Do you worry that, sometimes this might like detract from the, I suppose, the scientific expertise as it kind of lends itself to the sort of like societal norms, where now we have, where everyone feels validated in their opinion, whether it's like informed or not, which I think is quite a good one.
Yeah, I mean, that can become a real issue. So I was talking to some of the graduate students in my lab the other day, and they were talking about, yes, everyone now believes that they know what PCR is because you have a PCR test to see if you have COVID, and you need a PCR test to travel. And so it's become a common everyday phrase that people use, and whether they really actually understand what that means, worried, so of my students, because then people think they understand what they do. I don't think it's a huge risk. We all, well, no, I was going to say we all, not all of us, many of us know how to drive a car or, things like that. And we know what the names of the things are, but we very quickly realize that we can't just open up the hood and do most of it ourselves. Yeah, we need to go to an expert to actually help us, or we'll just break the thing.
So you're a job safe for the moment then. We can rest assured on that one. So
I would love nothing more than my job to be completely displaced by young, brilliant people.
Okay, so I've got one from Sarah, which is actually was going to be one of my questions as well, because it's a really good one. When we were thinking about obviously the speed of the vaccine sort of rollout, and sort of how amazing that was, do you think that only happened because of obviously the seriousness of the pandemic, or do you think that kind of like collaborative approach, is what she says, could be replicated again for other sort of challenges, other serious issues, or do you think that was like a one-off that's never going to happen again?
No, I think it will happen again, and I think it will happen more and more. We were moving strongly towards a very global society for all kinds of reasons. The last few years have seen a bit more parochialness in different areas of the globe, but I think ultimately we will have more and more collaboration like that to solve problems. We've got the same issue coming up with climate change. We've got COP26, the conference of parties that will take place in Glasgow. Even that was pushed back a year by coronavirus. And if governments don't come to that and agree with each other and collaborate on what our actual goals are going to be, we're going to have a real problem in terms of climate change. And not that strange thing that people keep talking about and long projections into the future. We're now moving into the parts where yeah, actually, there are more storms and sea level is rising, and it's going to be really hot and dry, and our houses aren't built to deal with it. Okay? It'll show up, and we've got to work together to solve that. And
Yeah,
we can. Just demonstrated we could.
Yeah, I think quite a lot of people kind of see it as like a dress rehearsal type thing. And obviously this is not going to be the only challenge that we're going to face, right? So yeah, really good stuff. Okay, I've got one from Daniel about the vaccine. Do some European countries have a cultural problem with the AstraZeneca, or are there questions, for Astra to answer, or somewhere in between?
Not sure I really know the answer to that. I think there are probably lots of government issues and delivery issues that are happening at the same time that we probably, well, we know we don't have all the facts to, because AstraZeneca just says we can't say. So whether those are actually cultural problems, which they could be, or they're just governmental issues and governments trying to push things around in their favor, I'm not really sure. It's not clear to me why there would be a strong cultural issue, but maybe there is.
Okay, so we've got time for maybe another one or two. So I've got one here from Abraj, and he's sort of speaking about the I suppose the potential of this new vaccine. So how much potential do you think the new vaccine will have through mRNA and CRISPR for like other diseases? Yeah, so I'm not entirely sure what mRNA. You'll have to enlighten me on that one. It's a bit outside my field.
Messenger RNA. Yeah, so this is that particular virus, the coronavirus, actually has RNA rather than DNA as its genetic material. And so, but the actual technology that was being used here is a different one. I won't go into all the details because we don't have time here, but those are two newer methods that were being used to actually manipulate genomes so that we could quickly develop vaccination, which is basically a toned down version of the virus, or bits of the virus that you can't actually get sick from, but you can train your immune system to respond to the virus if you actually did get it. And I think, yeah, those technologies have been in place for a while, but I think they will now be used more and more. I don't think it got very much news, but it was absolutely true that a lot of the methods that people have developed along the way here to deal with coronavirus and come up with ways of trying to come up with a vaccine have actually now been transferred already over to dealing with things like AIDS. So those technologies and the huge amounts of money and effort that were put into them will have massive benefits in other areas as well.
Okay, thank you for that. So we've probably got time for one more, maybe. So I've got one here from if I think it's Iftikhar. I'm sorry if I've got that wrong. And I suppose this is kind of like just from a sort of like a researcher's advice point of view. So what would your kind of advice be on dealing with anxiety and stress resulting from delay in fieldwork due to the pandemic? As a PhD student, research, it's very hard to cope with such unforeseen situations. I imagine you know quite a bit about this yourself.
Yeah, it's been a real issue for a lot of people. Hang in there, to be honest, is my best advice. Try to come up as much as possible with other solutions for things. And that's been pushed by the government and the university to, can you come up with another way? I know that's not always possible. And I know that people have already put huge amounts of effort into doing that. And yet there are some things you just need to be able to get out of the field. You just need to be able to get into the lab to actually do those parts. And they're critical to people's research. Hang in there. PhD is an important step on your way, but it's not the only step. There are lots of steps after that. And this isn't the first time that people haven't been able to do things. I can remember not too long after I got to the UK, we had a foot and mouth disease outbreak, and pretty much anybody who did work anywhere in the field wasn't allowed anymore because you weren't allowed to move around between sites. It was against the law because of fear of transmission of foot and mouth disease. So hang in there, and I think it will be okay. Do your best. People will recognize that this happened. You know, no one's blind to the fact that you weren't allowed to do stuff for this period of time. And remember, PhD is an important step in a research career, but it's not the last step.
I think that's a nice positive note to sort of end on there. So I just like to say thank you, Richard, for giving up your time today. It's been absolutely amazing. I'm sorry that I've not managed to get to all the questions, guys. Apologies for that. But obviously this isn't the end now. So just jump onto the Slack to the Slack, follow the link there, continue with obviously the comment and the discussion there. Yeah, and obviously I hope you enjoy the rest of your sessions today. And thanks again for Richard. You've been absolutely amazing.
Thank you very much for the invite.